I suspect that in most every church, and I know it's the case in this church, there are second and third and possibly even fourth generation Christians. You know what I mean by that, don't you? You're a Christian, and you grew up in a home where your parents were Christians, and maybe their parents before them, maybe they were Christians, and so here you are, a second or third or fourth, or maybe even more than that, generation Christian. I've seen that in a number of places where I've gone to preach, where there's this long heritage of faith that is passed down one generation to the next. And when you see that, it's a beautiful thing. Because what that says is that a lot of work has gone into the passing down of faith from one generation to the next. A lot of hours have been spent teaching children. A lot of hours have been spent with grandchildren on a lap, talking about the Scripture, singing songs, saying prayers together as a family. And it's wonderful to see families that have that multi-generational heritage. But I want to tell you, when you have that in your family, if the Bible teaches us anything about generations, it teaches us that the farther you get from that first generation of genuine faith, the less genuine faith can become in generations that follow. Or at least there is the possibility of that. So we think about this idea of generational heritage, passing down heritage of faith in Christ. We have to think about the possibility that the latter generations may not be as genuine in their faith as the former generations. Every person needs a faith that is genuine. Every person needs a faith that is their own. You know, we can't stand before God and say, you know, God, I'm in good standing with you because my mom and dad served you all of their lives. God, I'm in good standing with you because I'm a fourth generation believer. I want to tell you, that's not going to get you anywhere. We're going to stand before God and answer for ourselves. Not for our parents, not for our grandparents, not even for our children. We're going to answer for ourselves. And so it is important that each one of us has a faith that's ours. And so we read from 2 Timothy chapter 1 where Paul said to Timothy, there is a genuine faith in you. And that's really what we all want. Our faith is our own. It's not someone else's. Now, I had you open to 2 Chronicles 24. And I did that because there's a story here of a young man who, for a time, it seemed that he had faith in God. He was doing all the right things. He looked like a religious person. He looked like someone who was a strong man of God. And he was even a king. He was the king of Judah. But then things fell off the tracks. And I want us to see why, as we think about this idea of having our own genuine faith. So we're talking about Joash, king of Judah. Your translation may call him Jehoash. It's the same person, same name, or different name, but same person. But in 2 Chronicles 24, we have the story of Joash, the king of Judah. Joash becomes king at 7 years old. Chapter 24 and verse 1, when he was 7 years old, he became king, and he reigned for 40 years in Jerusalem. Now, like most child kings, Joash has a group of advisors. He's 7 years old. He can't exactly rule the nation. So he's got a group of advisors around him who will make policy decisions, who will choose what the right course for the nation is. And while Joash is technically the king, he's still over there eating his Cheerios. These guys are the ones who are really doing the work, okay? Now, among his group of advisors was the chief priest, a man whose name was Jehoiada. Jehoiada, the chief priest. He was a very good and righteous priest. In fact, if you go back to chapter 23, you can read about some of the things that Jehoiada did. You can read about some of the good things that he did for the people of Judah. Good, strong, godly, righteous priest. Okay? Good man to have in your council of advisors. Well, Joash listened to Jehoiada's guidance as he was growing up, and he was ruling as that child king. Jehoiada was there along with others, but the Bible places particular importance on Jehoiada and his influence on Joash. Joash is listening to him. He is taking his guidance. But look at verse 2 of chapter 24. Joash, the king, did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. Now that's interesting. At least underline that in your mind, because most of the time when we read about the kings, whether it's in the book of Kings or in the books of Chronicles, it will say, this king did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days of his life. Or this king did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord all of the days of his life. But in this verse, it says that Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada. The direction is shifted to the priest. That's unusual. If you go back to 2 Kings chapter 12, 2 Kings chapter 12 is a parallel passage. Look at verse 2. Joash did right in the sight of the Lord all his days in which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. So he's doing what's good. He's doing what's right in the sight of the Lord all the time that Jehoiada is there with him. So as long as Jehoiada is there in his council of advisors, things are going well. Joash is listening to his guidance, and the nation is doing good. Now go back to 2 Chronicles chapter 24. And as we make our way back, I'll just mention this. You've probably picked up on it by now that there's not a PowerPoint this morning. Just listen, all right? Just listen well. We're going to primarily be in 2 Chronicles 24, so it'll be really easy to follow the lesson this morning. Now we're not going to read these verses, but I just want to summarize verses 4 through 14. Just kind of tell you what's going on in these verses. Joash makes the decision that he wants to restore the temple of God. It's kind of been run down. It needs to be cleaned up. You know, if you own your home, you know that there's general routine maintenance that you have to do on your home. If you don't do it, it's going to get run down. It's going to get dirty. It's going to fall apart. The same is true of God's house. Maintenance had to be done every now and then. And there was a tax that the people had to pay according to the law of Moses. And they would pay this tax, and that money would be used to keep the temple functioning and keep it in good order. So Joash says, hey, it's time to restore the temple. So the people start giving their money. The priests, the Levites, people eventually get on board with this, and the temple starts to be restored, and everything is going well. Everybody's excited about it. And in verse 14, it says that when they had finished, they brought the rest of the money before the king and Jehoiada, and it was made into utensils for the house of the Lord, utensils for service and the burnt offering, and pans and utensils of gold and silver. Now notice this. And they offered burnt offerings in the house of the Lord continually all the days of Jehoiada. Once again, the emphasis is not on King Joash. The people are restoring the temple. They're excited. Everybody is happy. They're offering burnt offerings continually before God. As long as Jehoiada's there, everything's going well. Well, then Jehoiada dies. Look at verse 15. Now, when Jehoiada reached a ripe old age, he was 130 years old at his death. Did you hear that, Miss Pat? You still got 40 years to go. He died at a ripe old age, at 130. Now, when Jehoiada dies, things start to fall apart in Judah. Verse 16 says, they buried Jehoiada in the city of David among the kings. Note that. Buried among the kings. He is given the most proper and respectable burial that one can get. This man is buried among the kings, the prominent men. That's how much people thought of Jehoiada, because he had done well in Israel and to God and his house. But here's where things start to shift. After the death of Jehoiada, the officials of Judah came and bowed down to the king, and the king listened to them. They abandoned the house of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and they served the Asherim and the idols. So wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem for this their guilt. You know, in verses 4 through 14, Joash is restoring the house of God. And he's pouring money into restoring the temple, and there's worship, and there's praise, and everything spiritually is on the right track as long as Jehoiada was there. But when Jehoiada dies, there are some leading men of the city, officials who come before King Joash, and I take it that while Jehoiada was living, he kept these officials at bay. He kept them away from Joash. But now that he's gone, they get their access to King Joash and they say, listen, we've been worshiping Jehovah long enough. It's time to go to the idols. It's time to start worshiping these pagan gods. And Joash listens. And so it says they abandon the house of the Lord. After restoring it, after worshiping in it, after putting in all of that investment into it, now they abandon the house of the Lord, and wrath comes upon them. God is angry with them now because they have suddenly done a 180. They've taken a whole new direction. Verse 19, yet he sent prophets to them to bring them back to the Lord, and though they testified against them, they would not listen. So there is this great spiritual decline that's taking place in Judah. And Joash is leading the way because he is now listening to the wrong advisors. Jehoiada's gone. He's now listening to these other officials, and they convince him to go into idolatry, and he takes their advice. God sends prophets to them, but they don't listen. But there's one prophet in particular that God sends who is of some importance. Look at verse 20. Then the Spirit of God came on Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest. See, Jehoiada has this son, Zechariah, and the Holy Spirit of God comes upon him, and he is going to become the prophet who goes to Joash and says, what you're doing is wrong. And so he stands above the people, verse 20, and he said to them, thus God has said, why do you transgress the commandments of the Lord and do not prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he has also forsaken you. What's going on here, Joash? When my dad was living, things were going great. You were worshiping God, you were faithful to God, you had the Lord's blessing. And now that my dad is gone, you've listened to these other men, you've led the nation into idolatry and paganism, and God is angry with you. You have broken the commandments of the Lord. Now remember who this is now. It's Jehoiada's son. Now look at verse 21. So they conspired against him, and at the command of the king, they stoned Zechariah to death in the court of the house of the Lord. And thus Joash the king did not remember the kindness which his father Jehoiada had shown him, but he murdered his son. And as Zechariah died, he said, may the Lord see and avenge. Can we stop and appreciate this for a moment? Joash has been guided and following the advisement of Jehoiada for all of these years, and he has been blessed through that. Jehoiada was a strong blessing to Joash. And now, he mercilessly kills Jehoiada's son. What's happened? We'll keep reading. Verse 23. Now it happened at the turn of the year, I take that to mean the next spring. At the turn of the year, that the army of the Arameans, or the Syrians, came up against Joash. And they came to Judah and Jerusalem, destroyed all the officials of the people from among the people, and sent all their spoil to the king of Damascus. Indeed, the army of the Syrians came with a small number of men, yet the Lord delivered a very great army into their hands, because they had forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers, and thus they executed judgment on Joash. God is so angry with Joash and with Judah now, that when a small army from Syria comes, and they face a large army of the people of Judah, the Syrians win, because God was not with them. And this was a judgment from God that fell upon Joash. Now let's catch verse 25, and then the story of Joash is going to come to an end. When they had departed from him, they left him very sick. That is, Joash was very sick. His own servants conspired against him because of the blood of the son of Jehoiada the priest, and they murdered Joash on his bed. So he died, and they buried him in the city of David, but they did not bury him among the kings. Remember where they buried Jehoiada? They buried him with the kings, that honorable burial. But they didn't do that for Joash, because there was no honor in his death. Jehoiada dies shamefully and ignominiously on his bed because his servants, they recognize that what he did to Zechariah was wrong. And so they come and they murder him on his bed to avenge Zechariah's blood. Here's what I want us to see from all of this. Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord as long as Jehoiada was there to make sure he did. But when you took away Jehoiada's godly influence, Joash has no real faith. He has no real genuine love and appreciation for God. Just whatever his advisors tell him to do, that's what he does. And if Jehoiada is advising him and telling him he should restore the temple and he should be faithful and true to God, that's what he's going to do. But when these other officials come along and they say, hey, we need to go and worship the idols of the land, that's what he's going to do. He just goes along with whatever he's told by his council. Had you seen Joash in those early years of his reign, you would have thought that is a good, godly king. Look at what he's doing. But then the train comes off the tracks. And the reason it did is because Joash's faith in God was never his. It was Jehoiada's faith. And as long as Jehoiada's influence was there, Joash was a man of God. His faith was not genuine. Now, go with me to Acts 16. I want us to contrast what we see in Joash with what we see in Timothy. Acts chapter 16. Acts 16, look at verse 1. And we're on the second missionary journey of Paul here. And Paul and Silas are traveling together. And it says that Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. And a disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer. But his father was a Greek, and he was well spoken of by the brethren who were in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted this man to go with him. And he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those parts, for they all knew that Timothy's father was a Greek. This is setting the stage. This is our introduction to this young man named Timothy. Timothy is a believer. And he is a believer, I'm sure in large part, because his mother was a believer. As you notice in verse 1, his mother was a Jewish woman who was a believer. And so Timothy grows up learning about the true God. He grows up learning about who God is. I'm sure he grew up learning the Old Testament and learning the laws of Moses and the commandments that God gave through him. Timothy grows up in a religious house. Now, when we turn to 2 Timothy chapter 1, The passage that we read for our scripture reading this morning, 2 Timothy chapter 1, we add another piece to the puzzle here. 2 Timothy 1 and verse 5, where Paul says to Timothy, I am mindful of the sincere or genuine faith within you. Timothy, there is a genuine faith within you. Well, where did that come from? He says, it first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am sure that it is in you as well. So you look at Timothy's family heritage. We would look at Timothy and we would say that Timothy was a third-generation believer. He's got his grandmother who's a believer. She taught her daughter to be a believer, and she taught Timothy to be a believer. Timothy was a third-generation believer. If that's what we think, we're wrong. Timothy was not a third-generation believer in this sense. Every person must become a first-generation believer, no matter what generation you are down the line. Timothy's not going to stand before God and say, well, my mom was faithful, therefore I'm okay. Doesn't matter what I do, my mom was good, so I'm good. My grandmother served you, Lord. Doesn't matter how strong my faith is, my grandmother was faithful to you, therefore I'm good. Well, it doesn't work like that. And so while we do see 3 generations of faith being passed down, Timothy had a genuine faith within him. And it wasn't like Joash, who, as long as Timothy's mother was there telling him what to do and what to believe, Timothy believed and he did the right things. But you take away the influence of his mother and his life falls apart. It wasn't like that with him. You see, in Acts 16, Paul takes Timothy with him on that journey. And Paul travels all over the world preaching the gospel, and Timothy's right there with him. Where's Timothy's mother? I know where she is. She's doing what my mother would be doing. She's back at home worrying about her son. But Timothy is out there serving the Lord. He is ministering to the saints. He is preaching the gospel. He is learning from his mentor, Paul the Apostle. His faith meant something to him. It wasn't his mother's. It wasn't his grandmother's. It was his. And it was nobody else's. Now I want to turn to 3 passages with you. 3 passages that I think will establish this point for us and encourage us all to have our own genuine faith that stands alone. First, go to Matthew 22. Matthew 22. Look at Matthew chapter 22, look at verse 36. A lawyer asks Jesus, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and the foremost commandment. Let me put a little bit of a spin on this. Let's read this in just a little bit of a different way. Jesus says, this is the greatest commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. It's yours. It's not somebody else's. Passage number 2, Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. My baby's telling me to hurry up. Philippians chapter 2, look with me at verse 12. So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for His good pleasure. Work out your own salvation. It's yours. You're not responsible for my salvation. I'm not responsible for yours. Now, there is a sense in which we are responsible for helping each other, and I get that. But ultimately, it's my salvation. And ultimately, it's yours. One more. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Look at verse 10. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body according to what he has done, whether good or evil. We realize that we are not going to stand before the Lord in one large group as the Taylor's Church of Christ. Well, I belong to the Taylor's Church of Christ, and because of that, receive me into the heavenly habitations. No, each one will be judged for what he has done. So these three passages, as well as others, highlight the significance of having my own genuine faith. And so as we close this morning, I want to ask you two questions. Two questions, very, very simple questions, hopefully thought-provoking questions. Question number one, what is the reason for your presence today? Is it family obligation? I think it is that way for the younger children. Well, my parents make me go to church. I know it's that way for some teenagers. You're going to live under my house, you're going to obey my rules, and we go to church, Family obligation. Sadly, I know adults who, that's the only reason they come to worship, because there's family obligation there. Maybe it's just others' expectations. Well, I go to church because I know if I don't, then the elders are going to hassle me about my attendance. Or, the preacher's going to call me and he's going to make me feel bad because I haven't been coming. So if I just go, I can keep everybody off my back. Maybe it's a resentful obligation. Well, I'm supposed to love the Lord my God with all my heart and my soul, and so I'm just going to go to church because that's what I'm supposed to do. I hope none of those are the reason you're here today. I hope the reason you're here is because you have genuine love for Christ. Question number two. What is the reason for your daily efforts at godly living? I trust that everybody here, doesn't go to work Monday through Friday and just, curse and swear as much as you can. And I trust that you're not going out on Friday nights and just getting hammered drunk because you want to have a good time. I don't think you're doing that. I think you're trying to live righteous and godly lives every day. And I want to tell you, I appreciate that. And the Lord appreciates that. But I want to ask you, why are you doing it? Let's look at those same reasons. Is it family obligation? Well, I'll get in trouble if my parents find out that I've been acting up. Well, that's what my parents taught me to do, so I'm just going to do it, even though it's not really what I want to do. Is it social expectation? Well, people look down on you if you get arrested for DUI and make a fool of yourself. And so people, I shouldn't do that. Try to stay out of trouble so I can keep up appearances that everything is good. Is it resentful obligation? Well, the Lord tells me that I can't curse and drink and swear and all this other stuff, and I wish I could, but God told me I can't do that, so I'm not going to do that just because I have to. Or is it genuine love for Christ? Because I love the Lord with all my heart. And I want to do for Him what is right and what is best. And these are the things that He tells me to do. And so that's what I'm going to do because I love God. I hope those are the answers that we give. And I hope it's none of those other things. And I hope that the lesson's been helpful to you this morning, encouraged you in some way, maybe challenged you in some way. I don't apologize for that. If lessons step on your toes, that's great. I'm happy. But the fact is, I'm not aiming for your toes. I'm aiming for this right here. And I hope my preaching will hit you there, at least from time to time. Thank you for listening this morning. If you're not a Christian and you realize that putting God first in your life and loving Him with all your heart is not what you've been doing, why don't you start today? Why don't you make it right today and begin serving Him with all of your being? If we can help you in some way this morning, would you please come forward as we stand and sing together?